Now, if that practice is self-inquiry, that entails concentration, clarity, and equanimity. It entails the same skills that I would say are found in mindfulness practice. In fact, it is a form of mindfulness practice. I have incorporated self-inquiry into my menu of, quote, mindfulness techniques. And it just works in a nice complementary way. If you do classic mindfulness practice, say with an unrestricted focus range, choiceless awareness or open presence, or, according to some Soto Zen teachers, just sitting is aware of everything and sort of holding on to nothing. So there's a whole range of practices that are sort of unrestricted in their domain. You focus on whatever comes up. So let's say that you're doing a technique like that. Now, I call that technique note everything. So what's entailed with that technique is whatever comes up, if it's, in my way of teaching it, if it's visual, like a mental image or a physical sight, or even a defocusing of your eyes, if it's visual, you note it as see. If it's auditory, mental talk, physical sound, or even silence, quiet, you're hearing that. If it's physical, emotional in the body, or restful in the body, you're feeling that. As each sensory event arises, you sort of can imagine that your awareness is like an arrow pointing to that sensory event. And if that sensory event instantly vanishes, you're aware of that. That's impermanence. But if that sensory event doesn't instantly vanish, you sort of soak your awareness into it. That's a very important principle called karnika samadhi, or momentary high concentration. You don't visualize your attention as being like an arrow, but it sort of is that way, like vectorially directed. And that's sort of classic mindfulness with an unrestricted range, the way I like to teach it. So your attention is going to each thing as it's coming up. Now, does that develop concentration? Well, even though you're not coming back to any particular thing, you are momentarily tasting concentration. So yes, and you also have to have equanimity, because it's choiceless awareness. Whatever comes up, you're not trying to get comfortable or find answers, you're just monitoring. So there's equanimity involved. And there's also sensory clarity, whether it's see, hear, feel. Also, as you know whether it vanishes instantly or sticks around. So there's concentration, clarity, and equanimity involved in this way of doing choiceless awareness. And we'll call it note everything. And we'll say that's one way to do mindfulness practice. One way. Now, with a very slight modification, what I just described becomes self-inquiry. But instead of pouring your attention continuously on each sensory event, if you were to imagine that the arrow of awareness is hollow, okay? So in classic Vipassana, you're pouring your attention down that tube into the sensory event, unless it immediately vanishes. But now let's imagine that you let your attention move wherever it wants to move, but instead of continuously pouring your attention down this hollow vector on sensory objects, instead of doing that, you briefly turn your attention 180 degrees back, and you try to look briefly and very gently past the knock end of the arrow. So you got the point end of the arrow looking at your sensory experience of inner and outer see, hear, feel. But the back end of that arrow, it may move around or it may stay in the same place, but whatever is just behind the back end of that arrow is where the observer is. And if you can just, out of the corner of your eye, or your ear, or your body, if you just look 180 degrees, that primordial perfection is always there. On the other hand, if you do mindfulness practice, eventually everything disappears as soon as you notice it, and the place it goes to when it disappears, okay, and the place at the other end of the arrow where the observer are, they're the same place. Without too much change in the technique, with just a slight creating of a contrast, you've got a technique that is a pretty systematic way to do self-inquiry, but I've mounted it in a kind of mindfulness framework. Furthermore, I'm going to claim that you have to have concentration, clarity, and equanimity. You're trying to detect something very subtle, the presence of the eternal observer, okay? The stillness, the still point of the turning world. That's a detection skill. You have to have equanimity with the disorientation that practice creates, the don't know state. Once you find that primordial perfection, you're going to need a lot of concentration power to hold it as you go about ordinary life.